It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, mate, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 100. Again, we get the chance to raise the bat one more time. We did actually record a show last week, and in my COVID state, I messed up the download and then tried to recover it and made it even worse. So now I do apologise to my fellow Hong Kong Jack, who I'll introduce in a moment, because he put a lot of work into that show, and it was unfortunately a technical glitch on my part. I can only blame a COVID infection. And Hong Kong Jack, how are you today anyway, firstly, mate?
I'm much improved from my. I was sort of out of action for a couple of weeks with pneumonia, but
you had pneumonia, yeah.
Yeah. In the time-honoured tradition of whenever any of these things are lost forever, I'm just going to say that we were smoking cover drives. We were hitting them out of the park. It was the best show we've ever done. You know,
it was the best show we've ever done, and it's a shame that it's gone forever. But we'll try and make it up to you, listeners. There's so much going on. I mean, the news is changing virtually every couple of hours, largely driven by what's going on in the United States. But there's plenty going on around the world as well to keep us on our toes. But starting with matters in Australia, Jack, Peter Dutton has decided to bring some of the Trumpian elements into our politics. Really around a Doge. Well, they call it a smoge. A shadow minister for government efficiency has been appointed in Jacinta Nampina-Price by Peter Dutton, and she will run a line through the public service, Jack, and make cuts, but they're not saying what they're going to make cuts about at the moment. It's a little bit like what's going on in the States at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's probably sensible politics. I don't think it will go anywhere much, but yeah.
It is a little bit of headline-grabbing stuff, I think, without a lot of substance to it, isn't it? It must be said, though, Jack, that Jacinta Nampina-Price racks up about 200,000 in flights and accommodation every quarter. Perhaps she should have a bit of run the smoge line across her own expenses.
Is that backwards and forwards to the others?
Yeah, look, to be honest, you do get heightened expenses for those MPs who live far away.
And in places where there is not where it's expensive to get to, you know.
Yeah, that's right. So you'll find that if you do look at the expenses for MPs, the folks who live in Perth or Western Australia, for example, they tend to rack up a fair bit of expenses in flights at least, and of course,
Kim Beazley used to say, I give us my address, seat 1A, and in the Qantas plane from Perth. You know?
I often wonder how difficult it must be for Western Australian MPs. They spend half their lives in the air.
Yeah. And some of them give it away early. Some of them give it away early because of that. I mean, in the same way that some of the Western Australian AFL players retire a little bit earlier because they get fed up with
sprint. Yeah. I mean, it's a bloody big country, and it's 4.5 hours, I think, from Perth to Sydney, or Sydney to Perth, Melbourne to Perth too, and it's a long time to be up in the air if you're doing it on a regular basis. No detail at all on what the media have rather mischievously called smoge rather than Doge, but there is the prospect, Jack, of a free lunch. You love a free lunch, don't you?
I used to specialise in lunch, but those days I haven't had
days are long gone.
well, I haven't had a pre-5 o'clock drink for a long, long time. So yeah.
Well, we are both we have both walked through the 1980s, Jack, and I was working in publishing at the time, and we would have pretty much a lunch every day, probably about 3 a week, and big uns too, really substantial, leave the car at home type exercises and finish up about 4. The word always was, very sensible word from my boss, the wonderful Ron Norman, the late Ron Norman, a wonderful friend and colleague of mine, who said, never go back to the office if you're full. Just keep going. Just keep going home. Don't walk into the office full. It's a bad look. So I always have maintained that. But the long lunch is kind of over.
I might add, we were a little bit busier than that. We didn't have quite that much freedom, but there was the odd Friday where it was generally accepted that not much productivity would occur on a Friday afternoon.
Well, culturally, Jack, the long lunch has kind of disappeared, almost disappeared. I remember.
Can you imagine a glass of port being brought around at the end of a lunch these days, and how common that was in the 1980s?
It was, yeah. Or you'd have a sticky. Yes, it was. I remember not so long back, just to speak of that sort of cultural change, when my boss at the Australian at the time invited me in for a meet up before Christmas, and he said, "Would you like? We'll go and get a sandwich." I thought, well, I'm not coming into the office just for a sandwich, mate. Thanks all the same. If you're not going to buy me lunch, we'll just park it. But the reason we're talking about lunches is that the coalition have created a policy which, for small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, it must be said, businesses with turnover under $10 million will be able to claim as much as $20,000 a year in meals and entertainment. But, Jack, listen to this. It excludes alcohol. What's the point?
I was going to say it takes away the point of it. Do you remember the scramble, the post-lunch scramble to get the check, the check, and put it on your credit card so that you could claim the expenses?
Put the expenses through, yeah.
Yeah, and everybody else tipped in cash. There were nearly fights over this.
My expenses claims at the publishing company that I worked at, William Heinemann and Co., was one of the great works of fiction this country may have ever seen in literary history. But I wasn't on my own either. There was a lot of nonsense. Around about that time, of course, the FBT tax came in during the Keating-Hawke period, where the long lunch, and that may well have sounded the death knell for the long lunch.
It did.
And it was no longer deductible. You could still have, we still had lunches, but they were no longer deductible as far as the company was concerned. Is this good policy, Jack? It sounds like a bit of I want to make myself look likeable type policy.
There's probably a bit of that about it. It is restricted to small companies. And I think the basis for that is that large companies now do the same thing. That is, they take people out for lunch, but they do it within the premises. They have caterers come in and good chefs come in and do a good dinner, a good lunch. And this is to give smaller companies who can't afford that some opportunity to compete, I suppose. I don't know. I don't think most people take much notice of it. The whole culture's changed about that sort of lunch.
Look, there was talk of games of golf and things like that, which would all fall under the deductibility of this. And the big blue, of course, is over the costing of it. Treasurer Jim Chalmers had put it through Treasury rather than the Parliamentary Budget Office. and they put the cost of it, the cost of this free lunch episode for small and medium-sized businesses at somewhere between 1.6 billion and 10 billion. It's a big scope.
Yeah, it is a big scope.
I should just say the Parliamentary Budget Office puts the figure at 250 million.
The 10 billion seems fantasy land to me. But
it does a bit, maybe a bit of clickbait there for the Treasurer. I'm not sure that it's a great policy. It wouldn't be one you'd hang the hat on in an election campaign. Put it that way.
I don't think it would shift many voters one way or the other. Would be my view.
I think the point of it is to soften the image somewhat of the coalition and Peter Dutton in particular. I think that's what it is. That he's not all grim and foreboding. He likes to get out and get a bit messy. Well, of course, you can't get a bit messy because you can't claim the booze.
I don't think the Liberal Party ever suffers from looking like it's doing something for small and medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, true enough. I suppose that is true. That is kind of their constituency if we really wanted to put a finger on it. I think there's some battle over what the Liberal Party's constituency is, but small and medium-sized businesses with turnovers under $10 million a year probably is their constituency in large measure. Labor campaign.
There's a battle over both parties' constituency. John Howard was in one of the English papers this morning, and he was saying, I always thought of it as the 40-40-20 rule. That 40% people were going to vote Conservative and 40% of people were going to vote Labor, and
those days are gone.
And you battle over the 20, and that doesn't apply to either party anymore. It's 30-30 and 30-30 and 40 is the new rule.
I think the last couple of federal elections we've had, I think Albo's election in 2022 was a bit of an outlier in that the two major parties got just over 70% of the primary vote between them. But it's been declining, and if we look at state elections, it's been declining. It sort of sits around the high 60s mark, the two major parties, which leaves an enormous number of voters really determining the outcome based on preferences. Labor's rolled out a series of campaign ads, Jack, and the campaign ads are, this is what we've done to help you with the cost of living crisis. So they're not trying to sweep that under the carpet. They're confronting the issue, which is, I think, the right way to do it. And then they say, these are the measures we've taken. And it's a bit of a Brady Bunch 9-screen episode. And one by one, these 9 measures come off, and then Peter Dutton's face appears with the Labor Party voiceover guy saying, and this man opposed every single one of these steps. It tells me that that Labor think their best go is to attack Peter Dutton, attack his leadership style, attack his politics, really.
Yeah, it's good politics if it comes off, and certainly he's not a hail fellow well met popular type, Peter Dutton, but people will vote.
Sorry, no, you go.
People will vote for people even if that's not their perception. As I'm told, he's actually much more like that in person, but he doesn't come across that way.
I was just going to say, having met the man a couple of times now, he is very approachable. But he doesn't. It's one of those things. There's a distinction between the perception and the reality. We saw this with Julia Gillard. We've seen this with other political leaders in recent times.
Yeah, Yeah, it was particularly marked in the Julia Gillard's case that the television version of Julia Gillard bore absolutely no relationship with the real person.
Well, and sometimes you could flip it the other way without wanting to attract the ire of Kevin Rudd, Jack. Some of the people you thought might be fun to be with weren't fun at all.
Well, I think that we'd be on pretty safe ground in saying that.
Yeah, well, we always have to be careful. He has threatened to sue me.
Yeah.
Oh, well, just the once.
If he was going to sue everybody who said that he was hard to get along with, there'd be a queue around the block, you know.
Yes, well, I did refer to him perhaps obtusely as potential sociopath, Jack, and he wrote to the Australian in full umbrage, threatening defamation proceedings, and I thought. And the Oz got back to me and said, how far do you want to go with this? I said, well, his own colleagues have called him a sociopath. So, I mean, there's a bit of a long line of claims here. Anyway, I'm very, very good at fake apologies, so I offered one. And there we go. Problem solved.
You're right about his colleagues describing him as such, but
on the record, on a public record,
yeah, that shouldn't that on its own wouldn't disqualify him from remaining Prime Minister. I mean, Bob Hawke's colleagues used to describe him as having borderline narcissistic personality disorder. In fact, not borderline, he had it. You know, they were his cabinet colleagues.
It can be a good thing in politics. Yeah, look, interesting stuff. I haven't seen any of the coalition's advertising yet. I stream virtually everything, so I don't see a lot of advertising, full stop. But during the cricket, which is streamed by Channel 7 alone and not Foxtel, the Labor campaign ads have been popping up. There's a very strong likelihood, or certainly as a consensus emerging among the financial commentariat, that there will be a reduction in interest rates handed down by the Reserve Bank on February 18th, and that might be the first of two before the next election, if the next election is going to be in May, Jack. That would be a godsend for the Labor Party, wouldn't it?
Well, it certainly won't hurt them.
Yeah, I mean, they will have to shake off this cost of living business, which has infected most governments around the world and left them, a lot of them anyway, being hurled from power over the last 12 months or so. But something like that, they would be able to pin their hopes upon.
They would be able to point to it and say, this is an indication that we've been through the worst and, you know, we're on the downhill slope. Whether that will work, I'm not sure. At the same time, we've had this most unedifying conversation about who knew what when about the bombs in the caravan. And in a sense, the Prime Minister should have been able to say, look, I keep those conversations with the AFP, etc., to myself. And if I think they were a bit slow in telling me, I'll be having that conversation with them. But when he tried to have that conversation, he looked completely unconvincing. It didn't look like he was telling the truth. And that's a problem that the cost of living thing won't fix. He doesn't look convincing in the job.
Probably didn't look hard enough at those early responses, Jack. I did see a lot of pieces in media reporting on it, who knew what and when, all that sort of stuff. I think his response, I think he sort of gathered himself and had a pretty good day in the Parliament on Wednesday. He said that he had offered Peter Dutton a security briefing. And Peter Dutton had declined, and then he went in, you just want to politicise this and so forth. But yes, you may well be right, his early responses weren't adequate. I mean, it seems that, and these are bigger problems than just a bit of political embarrassment, that the New South Wales Counter-Terrorism Squad advised New South Wales Premier at least a week before the PM seemed to know about it. But I think the bigger problem, Jack, is that the New South Wales Counter-Terrorism Force wasn't communicating to the Australian Federal Police. We did see Commissioner Kershaw from the AFP in the Senate yesterday in estimates, and he refused to discuss it. But there clearly is a bit of an issue there with information sharing. There's a long history of what we would call, sort of culture wars or lack of trust between our various law enforcement agencies, state and federal.
It's been going on forever.
It's been going for a long time, and it really needs to finish. So Peter Dutton actually has called for an inquiry into that. The inquiry won't happen, and I think on the crossbenches there's a sense that having an inquiry would be a bit of a waste of police resources. But these are things we really need to deal with, where you've got the credible threat of a mass death terrorist outrage, caravan loaded with explosives. That information should be shared across all intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies in the country.
People feel like they own their own investigation and don't want anybody else to interfere with it is one of the reasons these things happen. Plus, we're not sure they know what they're doing. They're wandering around in the dark looking for the light switch, that lot down there. These things have been fixed a bit in the past by the Premier and of the relevant state and the Prime Minister getting their commissioners in a room and saying, guys, you got to fix this.
Yeah. I mean, look, if you work in counter-terrorism, Jack, regardless of whether you're a state police officer or a federal police officer, it's actually a criminal offence to name a member of a counter-terrorism squad anywhere in the country, which is, I guess there's a good reason for that, but it does mean that, it's sort of an indicator that a lot of these investigations can be very obscure. They can go, as this matter did, go under the radar for a long period of time, and the media, in fact, it was a journalist who broke the story. I think Daily Telegraph journalist who broke the story here, because the police weren't going to hand over that information. And that should be a bit of a problem. We understand that, sometimes the police need to investigate without a lot of clutter and media in the background, but at the same time they have to weigh that up against the public's right to know, particularly around serious threats.
Then there's sometimes a conflict between, well, we're investigating this particular matter, which we know to be an offence, but we're also looking at in the context of perhaps there's a wider and bigger offence that we're seeking to investigate. And we don't want to jump in on the smaller thing because we're going to ruin the investigation into the larger thing.
So you can understand that approach.
Yeah, but these things are not easy to resolve, and these things, they should go up the chain of command to the senior people who will make the call on that.
For what it's worth, ASIO, who clearly know about it now, and just one might ask, when did they find out about this? They have not amended Australia's terrorist warning, which they continue to list as probable.
I personally don't think a public inquiry, it would take a long time, and it would shed a fair bit of heat and not much light, and
most of it would have to be held in camera anyway.
Yeah, Jack. That's exactly right. So I mean, none of these people who would be involved in this would be, as you said, you can't identify them. They won't be able to give evidence in person in open court. So I don't see the point of a public inquiry. But
Yeah.
but it does look like some practices need to improve. Put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's the bigger issue, and we can talk about the Prime Minister perhaps being slow to be advised, but the real issue is these sort of petty jealousies that work across various agencies, law enforcement and intelligence in this country, and they need to get better at that.
They become a bit of a pissing contest, to be quite honest.
Look, I can tell you, having spoken to many, many police officers over the journey, that there is a great deal of what we would say derision directed towards the Australian Federal Police by state agencies.
Yes, yes.
They believe the AFP are not. It's probably not quite as bad now, but that the AFP are not quite serious guys. That they're basically traffic inspectors, parking meter guys, or parking officers given a fresh gig. Toy
Town cops, you'll hear used a bit,
Yeah.
All sorts of derogatory nicknames for them. I mean, I was asked the other day, has there been any arrests by an American fellow? Have there been any arrests for the synagogue burning in Melbourne? I said, not that I'm aware of in the news, but there are all sorts of reasons why the progress of that investigation would be kept quiet.
Absolutely. I did notice, by the way, the two fellows were arrested in the Darlow bar, Jack, with holding what appears to be swastikas or swastika-type flags in the Darlow bar, Jack. You'd remember the Darlow bar pretty well, wouldn't you?
I can remember we used to put our name down at Fish Face, the little restaurant there, great little fish restaurant, and you'd go to the Darlow bar and they'd ping you on your phone, you could come back.
It was a great collection of characters, colourful characters down there.
A great collection of the weird and wonderful.
Weird and wonderful. Many stories there that probably aren't worth telling now. Some wonderful characters. I used to drink there every now and then. It was a bit of a journey from News Corp, but a lot of News Corp people used to assemble there, or a number of them did.
It looked a bit like my local here in Hong Kong, which means it looked like the Star Wars bar and that Star Wars cantina in the movies.
Did have a bit of a feel like that. But two men arrested, and both refused bail, Jack, for bearing swastikas. And of course, Chris Minns has talked about legislating around anti-Semitic hate crimes.
It's around the corner from the Jewish Museum too. I think
that's right. Yeah, within a block of the Jewish Museum there in Surrey Hills or Darlinghurst. Moving overseas, Jack. Are you looking forward to journeying to the Gaza Trump Casino, 18-hole golf course, plenty of parking?
I saw the ad this morning to buy a condo in the Gaza Trump apartments, and the special bit at the end is a discount for early buyers off the no plan.
Excuse me, I knew that'd make me cough. Yes, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between the 45th, and 47th president and his Secretary of State and his press secretary, Carolyn Levitt.
There was a bit of walking back going on, I thought, more to the point.
There was a fair bit of walking back. Unfortunately, the Trumpsters doubled down even today. So this is what he said, among other things, on Tuesday. He said, American interests slowly and carefully begin the construction of what would become one of the greatest and most spectacular developments of its kind on Earth. I hope we can do something where they wouldn't want to go back. That's the Palestinians, who obviously have to be removed, some would say ethnically cleansed, from Gaza, set up camp, and then set up camp somewhere or other in Jordan or Egypt, and leave the Gaza Strip alone to become the Middle East Riviera, Jack.
Yeah, I always look at Trump and when he's doing this stuff, and remind myself that he's a property developer from Queens and he negotiates like one. So what he's generally trying to do with all his bluster is to modify other people's behaviour to what he wants, to get them to do what he wants. And I looked at that and I thought I could see some sense in the threatening to put them in Egypt and Jordan, because he needs the wider support of the Arab world to do a deal. And they won't want the Gazans and the West Bank people in Jordan and Egypt. In fact, they'll outright refuse it. I mean, Egypt refused to take Gaza as part of the peace deal back in the 80s. Yeah. While Gaza was on the table, we're not signing anything. We don't want them. So
they do, however, receive a great amount of military aid from the United States. But again, that's a really complex or problematic, I probably should say. If you threaten to sort of withdraw military aid, whether it's to Egypt or Jordan, both fairly substantial recipients of US military aid, it's not US aid, which we'll get to, but military aid, because they can just as easily go, oh, well, we'll go and shop and buy in China or
exactly
or
right.
Russia.
Yeah. Well, they did go and shop and buy in Russia for a very long time.
For a long time, they
for
probably
that
still got a few MiGs lying around in hangars somewhere.
The ones that the Israelis didn't manage to shoot on the ground in 1967 or 1974, if there are any left from those days. But so my first glance at it was, well, that conversation needs to be widened to include the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs and Egypt and Jordan and Syria, to see where, if people are serious about having a two-state, an Arab state on what used to be Israel and a Jewish state, then that the solution to that requires a wider view of the Arab world than just the Palestinians.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's really the only thing that matters, just how the Arab world will deal with this. The Saudis, look, across the Arab world, there was a general response of WTF with a couple of question marks when it did seem to be a thought bubble, and he had everyone scrambling. I mean, he's saying that the Americans will not pay for the clearing up of Gaza, even though they will own it somehow. Troops won't be involved under any circumstances. And he's left sort of Rubio and Levitt to sort of tidy up and say, oh, no, look, it's not going to cost anybody anything. Levitt said the president will seek to do a deal with Middle East countries and they will foot the bill. And again, it's this WTF question mark response coming from the Arab world. But the Saudis...
They are going to have to foot the bill for some of it at least.
Oh, and they certainly should, morally should, and so should Israel. By the way,
yes.
But this is what Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia said. MBS. He said he has urged for accountability, calling for Netanyahu to be held criminally responsible for actions against Palestinians. He emphasised the need to end illegal occupation and recognises the state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, with Jerusalem as its capital, a significant call for justice and peace in the region. So this is the major stumbling block, Jack, is that all of the Arab world, as far as I can tell, I may be wrong, there might be one or two exceptions, all of the Arab world believe in a two-state solution.
Yes, they say they do. The Palestinians don't, and the Israelis used to, but not so much anymore. That's the problem.
Okay, just want to deal with this sort of disconnect. Trump said on Tuesday, I do see a long-term ownership position, that's US owning Gaza, and I see it bringing great stability to that part of the Middle East and maybe the entire Middle East. We're going to take over that piece and we're going to develop it, create thousands and thousands of jobs. This is the the New York real estate mogul at work here, and it will be something that the entire Middle East can be very proud of. We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal, and I don't want to be cute, I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East. It's a stretch, Jack.
It is. Is there enough room for a golf course? That would concern me.
Golf course and plenty of parking, few shops. And basically Rubio and Levitt had to basically hose it down. One about costs, one about it being a permanent removal of Palestinians from Gaza into some other place, yet to be determined. And that Rubio and Levitt were talking about it being a temporary removal. The prospect of it being considered as a piece of ethnic cleansing could not be ignored either.
Certainly,
seems like a bit of a thought bubble, and I know we're just going to have to get used to the Trump thought bubbles again. But when he utters them, you see all his staff scrambling around. I don't know if you saw his chief of staff when he announced it in the company of Netanyahu, Jack, the Israeli Prime Minister. There was a certain look of shock on faces there, and I think, or even worse, we've seen the little clip. And this is really a pointless thing, one of those social media obsessions, is that Trump actually pulled the chair out for Netanyahu to sit down. And Instagram and others have just jumped on. He goes, I thought we were the leaders here. I thought we were, it's just a show of, a rare show of good manners on behalf of Donald Trump, led to claims of weakness.
You talk about the staff looking shocked. When I was a young lawyer instructing in jury matters, we were taught pretty quickly that if a bit of evidence goes badly, and it can go quite badly when your client gets in the box, the thing is with the jury that's sitting there looking at you, you've got to look like
sanguine.
Well, we were expecting this. There's nothing the least bit surprising about this.
Got to get that poker face. Got to get that poker face going. Meanwhile, Jack.
So perhaps they're going to need some lessons in that at the White House.
Yeah, there was the chief of staff there. It looked like he's about to have a stroke. Elon Musk, Jack, and there are concerns about. There are lots of concerns around Elon Musk. But the use of his platform to basically denounce people that are either critics of Trump or critics of him, while he and his merry band of young incel programmers are sifting through databases, including the one of the Secretary of Treasury, which basically will have pretty much every American's name, address, and social security number on it. Did voters sign up for this, Jack? I think there's a lot of support, for example, superficially at least, or perhaps temporarily, around US aid, which we'll get to in a minute.
US aid is low hanging fruit. It's pretty easy to criticise that because most of the country is going to agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that there was, I don't know if you saw it, Jack, but it was announced that the government, the US federal government, had paid out $8 million in subscriptions to Politico. I don't know if you saw that, but I mean. Once you sort of dig through that a little bit, what it means is that government departments or individuals who work in government departments, if they're going to subscribe because it's part of their work, and basically most media is paywalled anyway these days, to some degree at least, and that sort of bill of $8 million is probably not that big.
It's for what they call pro Politico, which is a special service that you get. It's about 10,000 per subscription, I think.
Oh, wow.
And it's a special service that's basically for lobbyists and for people who work in government, because the government of the United States has gotten so big, you have to have outside consultants come in and explain it to the people who work in the government. So it's one of those professional. We've all seen them in various businesses, in various professions. You have these professional services that give you a lot of information or access to a lot of easily found information. So the big chunk of that 8 million was for these professional subscriptions, right? And that might be defensible. But does the headline look good for USAID?
Exactly.
No, it doesn't.
Exactly.
No, it doesn't.
If you just mentioned the $8 million figure, you'd have to say, well, Politico must be just paying everyone's salary there. But it's a bit more it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yes, it is. But it still looks bad. Is the answer, and the very existence of USAID looks bad because it's. We have too many around the world. We have too many of these sort of semi-independent organisations that are, in effect, protecting ministers and cabinet ministers from responsibility, because they sit between the government and the beneficiaries of government largesse.
USAID. I mean, I know that you've got a bit here from Mike Benz, who's a former senior member of the State Department, and he was on Rogan's program in December, and he claimed there is no aid in USAID. It's not an aid organisation. USAID stands for US Agency for International Development. What it's developing is all the activist organisations in foreign countries that the State Department is building to gain influence. USAID was created to be a central hub that organised all the different foreign clandestine operations. It has a $50 billion budget, whereas and I'm still quoting here, whereas the entire intelligence community is only $72 billion. But there's, this is soft diplomacy, really. That's what it should be called, right?
Yeah, and this used to be done by the CIA, or it was done by the State Department, and it was all cobbled together and put in USAID, right?
Founded during the JFK administration.
Yeah, that's right. And more of the functions of state and CIA got put into USAID as time went on, right? I think there's an argument that that's an idea that has some real limitations, because you do get this lack of ministerial or cabinet or executive responsibility, because you can say, well, it's USAID doing this, it's not us.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And look, that budget position, $50 billion being, more than 2/3 of the entire intelligence community budget.
Yes.
I can understand how some of it at least will be open to, shall we say, mismanagement. But the Arab News, this is the organisation known as Arab News, has a somewhat different take, Jack. And they report that President Donald Trump's administration plans to keep fewer than 300 staff at the US Agency for International Development out of the agency's worldwide total of more than 10,000. It's a major cut. Arab News says Washington's primary humanitarian aid agency has been a target of a government reorganisation spearheaded by businessman Elon Musk. The four sources familiar with the plan said only 294 staff at the agency would be allowed to keep their jobs, including only 12 in the Africa Bureau and 8 in the Asia Bureau. That's outrageous, said J. Brian Atwood, who served as head of USAID for more than 6 years, adding the mass termination of personnel would effectively kill an agency that has helped keep tens of millions of people around the world from dying. A lot of people will not survive, said Atwood, who is now a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute. So there's a genuine aid component there, and there will be some bad outcomes, Jack.
Yeah. The difficulty aid organisations and US aid have is that they very often spend money. They're like the NGOs; they spend money badly, and they are going to be able to go through this line by line and find example after example of waste and mismanagement. And that's the same with registered charities in Australia and around the world and NGOs. It's rife. It always is. Always will be.
But wouldn't it be better to have pairs of eyes looking up rather than someone like Elon Musk, world's wealthiest man, looking down, who could find all sorts of justifications for removing programs that may keep people alive or keep people alive. We're talking about
there used to be
obstetrics and things like that. Higher infant mortality throughout Africa and Asia as a result of this money being withdrawn.
There's a long history of people trawling through this sort of stuff to find the funny bits. There was, I can't remember the name of the centre, but back in the 1980s, he had a senator. He had an annual prize he awarded for the most egregious example of government waste. And there were some rippers here. There was one for the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which funded a project by psychologists for $121,000 on developing some objective evidence concerning marijuana's effect on sensual arousal by exposing groups of male pot smokers to pornographic films and attaching sensors to their genitals.
This is outstanding. This is outstanding work, Jack. I'm disappointed that I haven't come across this research.
Terribly important. The National Science Foundation for spending $103,000 to compare aggressiveness in starfish that drank tequila as opposed to those that were fed gin.
Again, very important, Jack. For those of us who like a splash of tequila every now and then, and might angry up.
Yeah. And there's a long list. He had this every year, so there's a history to all of this. And once again, USAID will be subject to the same kind of mockery and bad press that will result from that. But most of those organisations are just pretty terrible at delivering outcomes.
Yeah, but who else is doing it? I mean, who else is doing it if it's not the World Health Organization, Jack, which the US is no longer a member of, UNESCO. If this is not coming from the US, it's not going to come from anywhere. The only reason the Russians are incredibly active in basically actively stealing resources from Africa at the moment. And the only way they'd throw around a bit of money is if they could see something, a quid pro quo coming from it.
Yeah.
There has been a hiring freeze across the bureaucracy, Jack, and we'll get to some of the specific agencies in a minute. The Trump administration is offering every single federal employee, I don't know the specific number, it would be in the millions, I would gather, a buyout. And they've been offered a buyout, which with pay till September, 8 months, salary if they choose to take it. Federal employees will begin receiving the email. Have received the email. I think popped up about a week ago, didn't it?
It did. These things are generally awful policy. For this reason, is that an organisation that large will lose X percent a year just through natural attrition. People will move. The wife gets a new job somewhere else, so I've got to shift and get a new job. All that kind of stuff, And all of those with any sense will take the 8 months payout because that's just a bonus, right? And they were going to go anyway, right?
I'm just looking for a figure here. 2.3 million federal employees, Jack. Yes, look, that has actually been frozen by court order. A federal judge on Thursday temporarily blocked President Donald Trump's plans to push out federal workers by offering them financial incentives. The ruling came hours before the midnight deadline to apply for the deferred resignation program, which was orchestrated by Trump's advisor, Elon Musk. Labor unions said the plan was illegal, and US District Judge George O'Toole Jr. in Boston paused its implementation until after he could hear arguments from both sides. It will only remain in place until early next week, Jack.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that's
I guess we would call it here.
That's just a hiccup.
I can't see that one getting up. But now let's look at some of the agency stuff, Jack. I know that, a list was required. I always get a little bit nervous when we start talking about lists in government, Jack. A list was requested from the FBI as to every single agent in some way involved in the investigation of the January 6 rioters.
Which I'm told is 3,500.
Yeah, the FBI immediately demurred and then I think considered just sending out a list of names of perhaps senior investigators. But then now they have provided the entire list. It sounds a little bit like retribution to me, Jack, or retribution coming.
It does. I don't think it's a good idea at all.
It's not a very good idea. And this has gone across to the DOJ. Well, shall we say the old DOJ as opposed to the new DOJ, which is just about to establish itself. And basically, pretty much every employee within the DOJ has been given notice, Jack. Got the don't come Monday by email.
I understand the desire for retribution, but I never think it's a good idea. I do think it's a good idea to take out the senior people at the top who you think have taken the organisations in the wrong direction. That I think is fine, because the DOJ, the FBI, all of these are part of the executive branch and have to be answerable to the White House. They are not independent and not meant to be.
Meanwhile, the former press secretary to the White House, Jen Psaki, I think she was two White House press secretaries ago. She said, I think she's got a gig with NBC, is it, Jack?
MSNBC, yeah.
MSNBC, yes. Jen Psaki has said what is happening now is a hostile takeover of the US government. I guess the question I would want to ask, Jack, is were the American people given sufficient detail before the election to provide what is a mandate for what's going on at the moment?
Trump talked about this all the time at his rallies,
but not in specifics, Jake. Not in saying to 2.3 million employees, we'll give you 9 months' salary and out you go.
No.
None of that was laid out. None of the sort of the US aid stuff. He did of course talk about retribution, as you say, with federal agents who are after him and after after all the sort of Jan 6 riders. He did talk about that, so perhaps we could have expected that. But this is a lot broader. I mean, there is what we're told, at least, and without really any public confirmation, is that Musk has been charged with finding $1 trillion worth of savings in federal spending. And no one was given any heads up about that before the election.
Yeah, I think you can try and mount the argument that none of this stuff was voted for, but I think it's going to be a really hard argument to win.
We'll get to a little bit of polling as we go. I mean, there is a sense, and this was put about by a couple of Trump allies actually, that Trump is actually, with all these executive orders, there must be best part of a couple of hundred of them by now, that he's kind of flooding the end zone, which is an American football metaphor for just, basically overwhelming people with these executive orders and the changes that will come with them, in order that people won't scrutinise individual executive orders.
And also so that his opponents are scrambling to catch up and can't respond to them bit by bit.
Yes, and look, anyone who thinks there is, there might be a bit of voters' remorse about all of this, the polling sort of shows otherwise at this very early stage, and you'd have to wonder about, the efficacy of polling at this particular juncture. I mean, we're 18 months away from. Hang on. Where are we? 20 months away from the midterms, Jake. 22, perhaps 21. So I guess there is some usefulness to it. And you've got an Emerson College polling which reported on January 30. It said a majority of voters think the United States is headed in the right direction, while 48% think it is on the wrong track. So, a small majority are supporting this as of January 30. So that's sort of a week away.
What caught my eye with that was the sudden turnaround from the figures from their poll beforehand, that a lot more people now think the government's heading in the right direction than had before.
And when we look at, and again, this is very early days, but when we look at Trump's approval ratings, he is, with few exceptions, has more people approving of him than are disapproving. It's still pretty narrow, but his approval ratings are really in the high 40s. Occasional tip over into the majority, but high 40s across the board, across a number of polls. There has been a lot of support for some of these presidential decrees, particularly around sending the military to the border, to the southern border. That was very, very popular with Americans polled. The other one that was received a sort of majority support was the transgender ban in women's sports. But there are a few others that haven't quite measured up, Jack.
Can I say about the transgender thing? That's a great act of self-harm by the Democrats. That's an 80-20 issue, as I call them. 80% of the American population agree with what Trump did. 20% disagree. And
it wasn't that high, to be honest. The polling showed, I think, about a 54% support.
Saw the CNN poll last night, 78% support.
I saw that too, actually. Well, I saw another poll that had it pretty high. Yeah. But if we go and have a look at this other stuff,
and the Democrats, by listening to a noisy minority, have found themselves on the wrong side of an 80-20 argument. That's political malpractice.
Well, I mean, I don't really agree. We're talking about, I think, just basic rights for minorities, Jack. And the way a democracy should work is that the majority elect a government that has to do its darndest to protect the rights of minorities. And so, I mean, I know this is a highly contentious issue around sport. Having spoken to people a bit younger than you and I on this particular issue, I think there is sort of broad support about the sporting ban. But, I mean, cutting people from the military because they're transgender, that seems to be discriminatory at least. And then we've got some of this really crazy stuff that's going on in some of the red states that that will make life very, very difficult for trans people to bear.
I'm talking about his actions on the sport. That's an 80-20 issue, and the Democrats found themselves on the wrong side, and I think that's terrible.
Well, again, we are dealing with the rights of a minority. I think there is broad support for the sporting ban. But some of these other things, the worst response insofar as Trump was concerned to an executive order came around the pardoning of the January 6th rioters.
Yep.
The pardons and commutations had only 37% approval, including just 60% support among Republicans, with 51% opposition overall. And we've seen, I think, from memory, and I've been following this fairly closely, I think there have been at least 4 of those who've been pardoned who are either on the run for other offences, including 2 involved with child sex offences and possession of CSAM, child sexual exploitation material, CSAM, and another one shot dead in Ohio, I think it was. So I think it's sort of proving to people that some of these guys weren't lovely people. In fact, some of them had some significant criminal backgrounds, criminal antecedents. So that was the worst of them. Interestingly, Jack, Trump's withdrawal from the World Health Organization had just 38% approval. And then the withdrawal of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was as predictable, it was one of those first day in power jobs, was entirely predictable. Only 39% approved of that and 41% disapproved. Interesting. But we are way too early into this administration to make any determinations about it, other than to say right now I would probably speculate that Trump's support is at an all-time high right now.
Yes, I think that's right. But there is a fair bit of time left for the Democrats to get their house in order before the midterms, and they've got some policy positions to fix because Trump wasn't all that popular even at the election, but his policies were popular. The Democrats were underwater on immigration, on identity politics generally, on energy costs, all that sort of stuff. They're underwater on all of those things. If they can tidy up their policy positions on those, they'll be competitive in the midterms.
All right. Now, tariffs. Canada and Mexico were dealt a pretty poor hand, and then, Trump backed down. And the story goes, of course, that both the Mexican president and the Canadian Prime Minister got on the blower to Donald Trump and assured him they were going to do a lot about border control that they'd already promised in the first place, Jack. In fact, there were 20,000 Mexican army troops on the southern border, and Trump's only asked for 10, so I guess they can let 10,000 of them go home. So the Canadian tariffs and Mexican tariffs, 25% across the board for the number 2 and 3 trading partner of the United States, did not go over well in either country, but the Canadians, they've... Look, they will have to bend. I mean, they because of the trade imbalance between the two countries, they will have to bend at some point. But as it stands, they've been pretty feisty about it, and across most of the provinces, I believe, American alcohol, booze, has been taken off the shelves by order of the provincial governors. and that will have enormous effect. You know, one of the biggest brewing states in the United States, not brewing, I should say, distilling states in the United States is Tennessee. A lot of bourbon and that sort of thing, and so that will impact directly on that particular state. It's a major employer of people in that state. So that looks to, you know, that the two countries have been given a 30-day reprieve. Do you think, you know, that Trump will just let this matter go? Just I'm talking about Canada and Mexico specifically.
I don't really know. Canada's problem is that 35% of their trades with the US, whereas the US has 5% of its trade with Canada.
Yeah, that's right.
You know,
Mexico's a similar. Well, Mexico's similar situation.
Yeah,
but there are certain things that the Mexicans make that will be that will have, you know, fairly profound impacts on American consumers, not least of all medications, Jack. A lot of the big pharma companies are producing generics in Mexico, and that makes up a substantial amount of the market consumption in the United States. So there'll be particular problems. Obviously, Trump identified one when he said that Canada's oil and petroleum products would be tariffed at the much lesser rate of 10% because the US does rely substantially on Canadian oil. China, of course, has been hit with, is it 10% across the board?
Yes, I believe so.
Date to be fixed. I mean, I just want to go back very quickly. The way that they set up the tariffs for Canada and Mexico, Jack, was, and you can't do these things overnight because basically US Customs will have to seek. If you have more than $800 worth of goods purchased in Mexico before you cross the border, just as a holidayer, then you'll have to pay duties on it. Likewise, Canada, the way it was. And so that's going to mean border crossings are going to be a little bit slower, the way it was. But China is in the gun for 10%. They've already responded with punitive tariffs of their own. And Trump has mentioned the EU, who he believes have betrayed the United States and will be tariffed fairly heavily.
Yeah, this is all about using the economic muscle of having the largest economy in the world to try and get a better deal for yourself. It's really as simple as that.
It's a negotiating tactic, I think a lot of people are saying, but where these things are in place, of course, China is the US major trading partner, as it is in Australia. And you'd have to accept that, particularly with, let's say, tax cuts coming and the price of goods in the United States, certain goods being shooting up by 10% at the supermarket shelf, for example, that's going to have an inflationary impact on the US economy and probably around the world.
One of the things that's interesting about the China situation is that they're talking about removing the exemption for small parcels and stuff. You know, there's a thing called drop shipping where people in the United States and around the world set up a website and sell items particularly into the United States, but other places as well. And they only buy the article when they get the money, and then they use Chinese agencies like Temu, who will package up the particular product you want and send it to the customer. So these are great businesses because you don't carry any inventory. You don't have any outstanding costs. You only spend money when you've got money that's already arrived. But the way they work is that instead of filling up a shipload of containers fully of a product, is you just send one or two or five in a box. So they're exempt from tariffs, etc. So there are moves now in the United States government to try and
lots
fix
more smaller parcels.
Yeah.
But at the same time, motor vehicle manufacture, for example, is that you will see, and look, this is one of the reasons the Canadians will have to fold, the big Ford plant in Toronto, Jack, is a major employer in the province and across Canada itself. But you'll have motor vehicles, let's say, a portion of assembly occurs in Canada, and then the vehicle or vehicles are shipped to Mexico for further assembly, and then into the United States for further assembly, and sometimes out to Mexico or Canada again, or perhaps another country altogether.
Yeah, very rarely the whole car, but there'll be parts that will cross the border. It could be 4 or 5 times. Yes,
yeah,
that's true.
Yeah. So, and they will be tariffed every time. The way it stands. All right, big talking point here, Jack. We should almost devote an episode to this. There's been a lot of talk in the UK about rejoining the EU. Let me just start by saying that is a political impossibility at any time soon. But some of the leading business figures are saying that Brexit, and this is from Guy Hands, who's a hedge fund manager, runs a private equity firm, Terra Firma. Guy Hands has called Brexit a complete disaster and a bunch of total lies that has harmed large parts of the economy. He went on to say the only way that Brexit put forward by Boris Johnson was going to work was if there was a complete deregulation of the UK and we moved to a sort of Liz Truss utopia of a Singapore state, and that was just never going to happen. That is Guy Hands. Lord Alan Sugar, and of course with a name, with a title like that, he is of course a member of the House of Lords.
He's also the bloke who does the UK Apprentice.
What's the show?
The Apprentice.
That's right. Yeah, I thought he also did that. The one where product developers will come and seek funding.
Dragon's
Shark Tank or something.
Yeah. Shark Tank. He does that.
I think he's been on that too. But obviously a well-known businessman and entrepreneur in the United Kingdom. He said the biggest disaster in my lifetime was us leaving the European Union. The full ramifications of us not being in the EU are starting to take its toll. If I was Prime Minister, I would be coming along on my bended knees asking to be let back in, he went on. But I don't think that'd go over all that well politically. Going to Belgium for a bit of begging wouldn't go down terribly well. But the facts are pretty damning, Jack. This is an analysis. There was an independent analysis done by Cambridge University that found London's economy has shrunk by more than $30 billion since 2022. Independent report. This is the Cambridge Econometrics commissioned by City Hall, London. It shows London has 290,000 fewer jobs than if Brexit had not taken place, with half the total 2 million job losses nationwide coming in the financial services and construction sectors. The average Briton was nearly £2,000 worse off, while the average Londoner was nearly £3,400 off. This is a rare acknowledgement that there are two countries in England, Jack. There is London, and then there is everywhere else, right?
The southeast and everywhere else, yeah.
Yeah, well, London's that big, yeah. But anyway, it also calculates that there are nearly 2 million fewer jobs overall in the UK due to Brexit, with almost 300,000 fewer jobs in the capital alone. Is it too early for me to say, I told you so, Jack?
Oh, it's never too early.
Look, it's a bloody disaster. Let's face it. They were conned. The British people were conned into this on the basis there was some sort of confusion around immigration policy. None of that's changed. In fact, the heat around immigration policy in the UK is intensified. But economically, they are much worse off because of Brexit. having said all of that, there is no prospect of going back, not in the immediate future. I mean, it would be political suicide for Labor to entertain the idea, in Starmer's term, and it would be like sending the Reform Party a nice little muffin basket and plenty of petrol for people outside of London to go, we voted for this and we feel betrayed that you'd want to go back on it.
Yes, I think that's probably a fair assessment.
So it's a disaster and it cannot be undone. Certainly not in the short term, over the next decade or so. And that takes us to a little bit of polling, very early days, as with the US. Reform is in front of Labor, Jack.
That they are continuing to pick up votes from both Labor and the Conservatives. The Conservative Party's in a sort of will they still exist position at the moment.
Yeah, look, it remains to be seen how seriously people are taking the Reform Party, or Reform UK, it's probably known as, and it might just be an expression of grievance at the moment.
A short-term expression of grievance, that's possible, yeah, but it's looking less likely that that's the case as time goes on.
Yeah. Well, we still got 4 and a bit years to go.
There are a lot of Conservative voters who will never go back, I don't think, because they are disappointed with what the Conservatives did over the last 5 or 6 years in particular.
Now, one of our avid listeners raised this issue, which has sort of gone under the radar as far as I'm concerned, Jack, but he said, do you think that Donald Trump, this is a friend of the podcast, we'll call him CD, not sure that he wants to be named, but he asked me if he thought the Chagos Islands being reverting to, or not reverting, but being essentially given to the control of Mauritius, whether Donald Trump would intervene in it, Jack, and ever the real estate magnate, real estate boss, he might yet do so. But tell us a little bit about what's going on there, Jack. The Chagos Islands, I understand a fair bit of the history of it. There's an indigenous group, I think, called Chagosans. They've been almost excluded from this. The Chagos Islands group in the Indian Ocean is also the home of, is it Diego Garcia?
That's a 60 or 70-year-old US and American joint, US and UK joint military base.
Yes. And so the UK is moving on and they're handing the islands over to Mauritius.
What happened was there was a ruling, an opinion, not a ruling, an opinion from the International Court of Justice that the continued UK control over the Chagos archipelago was incorrect as a matter of law. It's just not a ruling. The US doesn't recognise the court, and the court thought the islands should go to Mauritius, who have had no real connection.
No, this is the other thing.
The Chagos archipelago.
It's just that they're vaguely in the same part of the world.
They're vaguely in the same part of the world, and the only connection was that I think that at one stage when either the Brits or their predecessors as the colonialists ruled the Chagos Island, they ruled them from Mauritius as a matter of geographical convenience. It's a very tenuous connection, and to be frank, most international law is a nonsense, and this is a particularly nonsensical part of international law.
Like that. And as I said, the indigenous people there, I think I've got the demonym right. Demonin right, the Chagosians,
Yeah, the
they're actually
Chagosians.
prohibited from entering the Chagos Islands, Jack.
They are. A lot of them are in the UK.
Right.
I might add. The politics of this get a bit weird because James Cleverly, who was, I think, briefly the Foreign Minister, the Minister for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the Conservative government, started the process of negotiating with the Mauritians, and that was continued by David Lammy, the new minister, when the government changed. Um, uh, there is no justification for the decision. The Diego Garcia base is very, very important for both the UK and the US.
I think much of it, certainly very important around the Afghan conflict, but also I think that's where they took off from when they were after Osama bin Laden.
They did indeed. No, I don't think this will be allowed to go ahead. It's a kind of a really
beautiful
silly
place for a casino and a golf course, Jack.
Yeah, it's actually a bit small for a golf course. I took the time to have a look at it, and the actual Diego Garcia base, it's not extensive, you know.
Maybe a pitch and putt, not the full 18.
It's an airfield and a bits and pieces of things like that on a coral atoll, you know. The airfield takes up a fair bit of it. You could have a pitch and putt on the runway when they weren't using it. You know?
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, there's a couple of things that we've left outstanding, but we've got to move on to sport. And Jack, we'll just put those aside for next week. We've got some. There's one issue that I did want to talk about. The prospect, and certainly this has been the subject of political gossip on social media, is that. Starmer's government will reintroduce sort of blasphemy laws. No such bill is on the cards, but there are some moves, I guess, somewhere in that direction. There is a council to advise government MPs on Islamophobia to be created, and that's been sort of taken as. They're going to reintroduce blasphemy laws. Incidentally, Jack...
And there was a court case in Manchester where a judge did seem to be interpreting the law as allowing her to punish someone for blasphemy.
He might have, or was it a he or she?
She. Yeah.
A she. She might have been asleep for the last 16, 17 years. It was actually the Labor government who... rejected or revoked the UK's blasphemy laws in 2008.
Yes, that's correct.
So we want to have a bit of a chat about that because it is an interesting topic, and we also want to talk about the FCA in the UK. They're pushing a diversity line, which is supported by a great many women in the financial institutions, but is being derided as sort of DEI hires. So we'll put those aside for next week, if you don't mind, mate. And we'll move directly on to sport because there's a fair bit to get through there too. Last week we were advised that Peter Lawler, a former colleague of mine, who now runs a what do you call it? It's a Substack. With Gideon Hay and others called Cricket et al. I'm a subscriber just by the way. There's terrific content there, particularly from Gideon, but Peter's an excellent reporter on cricket as well. Peter was he has an X account. I follow him, he follows me, and he's got a lot of followers besides. He was reposting, I think it was considered the things that were causing offence or likely to have caused offence were reposts that he'd made in and around humanitarian issues in Gaza. After calling 4 days of the first test in Sri Lanka for SEN, Lawler was contacted by the boss there, Craig Hutchinson, and told his services were no longer required as a result of those posts, Jack. Freedom of speech. It's a vexed issue, isn't it?
Well, I'm a bit of a freedom of speech nut, And as you know, and I didn't have, I don't believe in giving people the sack because they say things that you don't agree with.
Well, he was told, according to Peter and being a subscriber, I read all this stuff, he was told, according to his account, he was told by Craig Hutchinson, and when he was asked, do you feel comfortable about making people in Australia feel unsafe? And he was obviously talking about Jewish Australians.
Yes.
When I looked at Peter's feed, I saw, him playing both sides a bit, but clearly more often was outraged at what he perceived were humanitarian disasters created by the war in Gaza. It seems to me that we almost need to have a set of rules around this, Jack.
I don't think you can, because a business like SCN needs to be free to employ who it wants to employ and to sack who it wants to sack. In effect,
yeah, that's true. Sorry, go on. I didn't mean to.
And this sort of came about in part because what's his name, Ralph Horowitz, a former sports journalist, a sort of semi-retired sports journalist in Melbourne, also has a Twitter account. And he was sort of waging Twitter war with Peter Lawler about this, right?
Oh, I did not see
and this happens. It's the sort of platform where this does happen, right? And I think it's unfortunate that Peter Lawler's no longer calling for SCN, but this is kind of how life works.
Well, I'm one of many subscribers to Cricket NL, so he won't be bereft.
No.
It's as I say, I'd highly recommend it. Gideon's writings on cricket have always been outstanding. He wrote a piece, Jack, about a reportage piece of the funeral of Ian Redpath, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. He knew Redpath quite well.
Both Geelong boys, I think.
Of course. Yeah. And what an astonishing character Ian Redpath was. Lovely story about one of our great leg spinners, albeit a woman, who played cricket for Australia, for the women's team in Australia. The very first test played against England, in England, took a whole heap of wickets and then turned her back on the game at 23 years of age.
I just...
Lovely stuff. It's well worth your time. So I think it's $10 for a subscription, and I'd certainly pay that $10 happily. It's good. There's a lot of content there. I don't listen to the podcast often, but the reports and Gideon's great writing around the history of the game is worth the price of admission.
Yeah, I think people can get. The ABC's got itself in an awful pickle.
Well, I was just going to mention Antoinette Lattouf,
Antoinette Lattouf.
Federal court right now.
I mean, she had a 5-day gig filling in for somebody else on ABC Sydney, and they sacked her after 3. And that didn't seem to make any sense to me at all. But they seem to have been panicked by getting some feedback, some unsatisfactory feedback on her. But she had 2 more days to go. Why would you sack her? I also read that she was employed on a $65 an hour contract to do 5 days sitting in on a radio program.
That's about right.
Is it?
That's about right. Oh, it's about right for a national broadcaster. If you wanted a gig on 2GB, mate, you could times that by 10.
Yeah, but I thought that was a bit skinny myself.
I see. Well, it is. I mean, the ABC rates are nothing like the commercial broadcasters. Look, I think it's a really vexed issue. I'm
as usual
more
with
and
the
more
ABC.
Cautious about what I put on social media these days. Not because I'm worried about my employer and how they might view it, but I just see X as a bit of a shit show at the moment, and life's too short to be involved in these sort of online feuds.
Yeah, I'm not a feud sort of person on Twitter, but as usual, I'd say about the Antoinette Lattouf thing, as usual, the ABC have blundered through this and made everything worse at every turn,
I believe that she was given a sort of warning of a kind, that there was a view that she was in breach of their editorial guidelines. And Jack, I've actually seen the ABC's editorial guidelines. It comes in those two lever arch files, those big ones, two of those.
Yeah,
two of those.
Like
I don't think anyone would know it word for word.
Like I say, that they've blundered through that again.
Look, and there is another issue around this, what we might call astroturfing, where a number of complaints are made, but from a very limited number of people. But it somehow seems a lot bigger, and I think in the end, media organisations, whether they're public broadcasters or private ones, really have to tough this stuff out a fair bit.
Oh, that's my complaint about the Democrats. Don't get run over by a noisy minority.
Okay. Australia and Sri Lanka, they'll be getting underway in about an hour's time as we record this on the 7th of February. Sri Lanka 9 for 229. Pretty good effort from all the bowlers, and Sri Lanka showed a fair bit of pluck in getting to a pretty good score on what is a raging turner, Jack. And it's it'll be turning backwards, not square. Be turning backwards by day 4 or 5 if it gets that long. A score of 230, 240 is pretty good. First innings score, and Australia will struggle there. Sri Lanka's made a number of changes, and of course spin will be the top. That's how well Australia plays spin. Usman Khawaja did very, very well in the first test, but albeit on a pretty flat wicket. And of course, Cooper Connolly will debut, or has debuted with the ball. Bowls left armers, left arm orthodox, but his role as a batsman. He only played 4 first-class games, Jack, and he's in the Australian side, so they obviously got big raps on him. And look, where are we? The 7th of February. In 12 days, Jack, the Champions Trophy gets underway, a one-day international tournament. First game begins on the 19th. I think that's with the host country, Pakistan. They don't play India, which is just a shame, I reckon. Just a shame. And Australia's first game is against England on the 22nd of February. No Cummins, no Hazelwood, no Mitch Marsh. It's going to be
no Marcus Stoinis as of yesterday.
Yeah, Marcus Stoinis announced his retirement from ODIs. He was obviously a squad member. It was an odd sort of move to do it before the Champions Trophy, but he says he wants to concentrate more and more on T20s and franchise cricket around the world. And so the Champions Trophy will be held ostensibly in Pakistan. Games played in Karachi, Lahore, Rawalpindi, and other games played in Dubai. So plenty there for cricket fans. The AFL, Jack. There was some very, very sad news during the week. West Coast Eagles Premiership player Adam Hunter and Brisbane Lions 75-game veteran Troy Selwood both passed away suddenly. The way these things are reported would indicate that both men had committed suicide. And that's a very, very sad thing. I remember both of them playing. Adam Hunter was a very classy big man, played centre-half back for the Eagles, premiership player, but would go forward and kick goals as well. And it's just a reminder that what people are carrying around with them it can just be completely overwhelming if they don't have a bit of support, if they don't reach out. So there's been a bit of a push, Jack, to make the AFL. I know these things can be seen as a bit gimmicky, but the first round to be a men's health round. where there will be, let's say, a 5-minute discussion point between the teams entering the field and the bounce down for people to be able to express themselves and have at least commence conversations about how they're going, men in particular. And I think that's an idea worthy of merit. But the thing that really got me about this terrible news during the week, Jack, was that the media are so constrained about what they can say around death by suicide.
Well, it's I'm reading this from Hong Kong, and you sort of look at it and you say, "Well, I presume this is suicide," but there's no mention of it. But I suspect people, there are all sorts of people like me who go, "I don't really know what's going on."
There's a certain form of reporting that sort of indicates that the phrase that's most commonly used is that police have indicated that the death is not suspicious, and that's generally the lead-in. I wrote a piece a long time ago, and it got substantially edited. I was writing about Robin Williams, who was presumed to have committed suicide. The great comedian, wonderful humanitarian. Very sad moment when he died. Now we know since that he was suffering from a very serious illness, and that probably drove him to suicide. But I had mentioned in that report the circumstances of his death. I had mentioned obviously that he had died by suicide, and all of that had to go. Because it doesn't fit what is a sort of self-regulatory constraint on the reporting of suicides. The view is that the more you talk about them and the more explicitly you'll talk about them, the more you might encourage people to commit suicide. And I'm not sure that I buy that anymore. I think that we really need to have open and frank discussions about it, so we can,
it's become a bit of a farce.
We should be able to have the conversation. The media should be able to, without being ghoulish or voyeuristic, the media should be able to report on these things. So we would, in actively discouraging people from taking the same action, from encouraging people who might be feeling they're alone and in desperate strife, that there is a way out, and that way out generally is to share their stories with other people, with friends, with family.
Yeah,
I think the way our reporting is at the moment doesn't encourage that.
Yeah, and standards in reporting change over time and need to.
These regulations have been in place now. These constraints, self-regulations, have been in place, I would say, for 30 or 40 years and maybe longer.
Yeah, I used to love reading the obituaries in the London newspapers. It's back in the days before it was fashionable to out someone as being gay, and you'd be reading the obit, and it would say, Mr. Harris never married. He had a wide circle of friends, left behind a devoted family, etc., 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 and everybody knew what they were saying. This bloke was gay.
It's just a euphemism, yeah.
Yeah,
a series of euphemisms,
and it was sort of a nice bit of nonsense in a way, but a bit more frank reporting would be better, I think.
Well, I don't really want to, talk specifically about Adam Hunter or Troy Selwood or any particular suicide and death by suicide. But we know across certain age groups, Jack, particularly the elderly, we've got a big spike in suicides.
Yes.
In this country. And I think we need to have better conversations. I think, Men's Health round one, I think they've done it before with the
they did
with a sudden death by suicide of Danny Frawley. We don't know for sure, and I think his family would object strongly to me saying that. But it was a single vehicle accident that he died in, and may have been related to a CTE diagnosis. And I think the AFL picked up and did have a sort of men's health round in years gone by. But given this awful news, maybe that's a good way just to contribute to that overall view. I know a lot of media have entered into the fray as far as they can and said, look, let's have these conversations. Let's encourage people who are battling to reach out. Let's never dismiss them when they do, and perhaps a bit more open reporting would be beneficial as well. Having said that, the protocols are, after we've discussed these matters, particularly around suicide, that we advise all our listeners that if you are doing it tough, don't be afraid to reach out, whether it's to friends, family, or give Lifeline a call on 13 13 14. You are not alone. All right. Well, that takes us out for episode 100A, Jack. We think we got through a fair bit today. Finished the show on, I think, what's a really important discussion to have around suicide, particularly of men in Australia, which is, as I say, if you look at the figures on the 60 pluses, Jack, there just doesn't seem to be any. It's just going through the roof, the numbers there. So we did finish on a pretty dark subject, but I think it's an important thing to have. We look forward to bringing episode 101 to you next week, and we'll have those discussions around DEI hires and the FCA in the UK and the blasphemy laws, which I think are all but forgotten. I'd have to have a look to see what blasphemy laws we've got in place, Jack. I don't think we've got any, have we? But,
no, never did have.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll have a bit of a chat about blasphemy laws and just what people might be charged with if they're in the business of a fairly offensive business of destroying biblical texts or Quranic texts or what have you. So we'll get onto that next week. Phil, listeners should feel free to drop me a line. I don't get on X all that often, but I do check my DMs all the time. And you can drop me a line on at Jack the Insider. My DMs are always open. And you can get hold of Jack on his Substack too. That's HKJack at
HongKongJack.substack.com.
HongKongJack at Substack.com. Well, that takes us out for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week. See ya.